We go to Kenya and we hear that a new breed of protest has left, and this story comes from The Economist. A new breed of protest has left Kenya's president tottering. President Kenya has capitulated to people power and cancelled hated tax increases. Please hold that line. So, in the lead, it says, though Kenya's equilibrium is occasionally punctured by bouts of political unrest, the country is generally seen as fairly stable, prosperous, and liberal. That, again, too, that line too is problematic, and I will tell you why later. Such cozy assumptions, however, were rudely jolted by tax riots, which reached a deadly peak on June 25. Overwhelming the police in Nairobi, the capital, protesters broke into parliament, set fire to a section of it, pinched the mace, and forced terrified MPs to flee. The security officers responded with fire, killing at least 23 people. And it goes further. Even more startling than the widespread nature of the protest were the attacks on the offices of the Kenya's MPs and local government officials, seen as aligned with Mr. Ruto's tax policies. Rarely has hatred for the political class felt so acute. The most pertinent rupture with the past, however, is the nature of the protest itself, which had a whiff of revolution. Hold that thought. The protests were the first in Kenya with more than a class tinge than an ethnic one. Ostensibly leaderless, they had distanced themselves from all politicians. Confronted with a new threat, Mr. Ruto, normally a deft strategist, had repeatedly blundered, underestimating the scale and nature of the opposition rained against him and miscalculating his response. The president's first misjudgment arose from the belief that alienating Kenya's small middle class will carry few tangible consequences. Alienating 17% of the workers in formal work may seem a little price to pay for winning the support of Kenya's vastly bigger huddled masses. So I'll quickly go back to the top here and listen to how they describe it, that Kenya's vastly big huddled masses. So what do they refer to here when they say the country is seen as fairly stable, prosperous, and liberal? For whom?
Exactly, for the elite, for the ruling class. But I'm glad that they actually mentioned the word class. And
Okay.
in the Economist, the Economist, it's becoming, so that was realistic, and obviously that is what's going on in Kenya. You see the class cleavages. You see, because often when you discuss Kenya, you're discussing the aftermath of elections. And then you start talking about, did a Kikuyu candidate win or a non-Kikuyu? And then there's the dispute after the election. Did Odinga, who is seen as the Luo candidate, was he robbed of victory?
Victory.
Right? So those are the
Correct.
issues that typically you read about when you deal with Kenya. So now, why this particular issue is different is because, first of all, it means that past social struggle or uprisings, they also may have had class elements, but because of the narrative that everything has to be so-called tribal or ethnic, that's the only type of coverage we typically get. On this occasion, they could not fall back on that default, you see, because you could not say, oh, this is being led by Luo. This is being led by Kikuyu. This is being led by Kalenjin, or what have you. No, they mobilize the young people on social media, and they said, these are the issues. We can barely survive, and if this tax goes through, then we're done for, particularly when some of the taxes are on essentials. In urban areas, you can't, a big city like Nairobi, you can't just go back into your backyard and plant vegetables or tomatoes, right? You
Correct.
have to purchase food in stores or supermarkets. So any taxation that elevates the price, this is very difficult to dodge. How do you avoid that? Right?
Yep.
So now when you have increases of up to 17% on staples such as bread, obviously people can see that if that goes through, I will not be able to survive. I'll go hungry, and eventually hunger will take its toll.
Yep.
So even if there's risk, it's worth coming out to resist. I'm going to get harmed by hunger anyway. If I'm going to be harmed by security forces, if I have a chance of blocking this, let me join this mobilization. And that is why it can be seen as the class component. You have the very wealthy elite who happen to be the members of parliament, who are the ones that enact these laws, and they send it to the president, who is also, of course, part of the ruling elite, to sign, and it becomes the law of the land. And on the other side, you have the working class, you have the low-income communities, you have the youth, who can also be seen as part of the working class, of course, right? They're not part of the ownership class. So that is why this particular social uprising in Kenya had many different components that we can talk about compared to previous ones, although the economists would not break it down the way that we are going to be breaking and analyzing it. But at the end of the day, one other important point that is actually consistent to all these African countries. It's not so much about Ruto, correct? Because they need the money. They need the money to pay their teachers. They need the money, supposedly part of the money they wanted to subsidize their farmers. As you know, the United States spends almost $30 billion every year just subsidizing farmers in this country who would have been out of business a long time ago.
True.
Right? They talk about let the market forces work. It's all nonsense, because if the market forces are supposed to work, then Africa would produce the food, sell it to the United States, and import the manufacture. But the U.S. does not want that. The U.S. produces, manufactures, sells it to Africa and the rest of the world, and subsidizes it farmer instead of using that money to import food from Africa. So that's $30 billion taken away from African farmers' table. On the other hand, as you and I know, under the World Trade Organization rules, African governments are not allowed to subsidize their farmers.
Of course not.
So this is something that they were doing, which is interesting, which is actually needed. But as I said previously, African governments are not in a position to tax the powerful. First of all, the elite don't want to tax themselves, right? They're not going to enact tax increases for, against their own assets and salaries, right?
Yeah.
They cannot tax the multinationals. They
Definitely not.
They could, but they won't dare do that. So they go to whom they perceive as the weakest element in this equation, which is masses. The Kenyan people, the masses.
So, one other question in that line. Following the fact that he has withdrawn the finance bill, when I say he, William Ruto, the president, would it be realistic to think this is the end of it, or are we just seeing the first salvo being fired across the bows?
It's possible that it could be the end of it in this particular form. But he still has to find revenue some ways. He might be bailed out for some short term by the IMF and World Bank. He was invited to the White House after all. So, I know Biden is really busy right now, but somebody senior in the U.S. administration would pick up the phone if he dialed, and he made it clear that resources are needed very quickly. The United States, I don't see them not supporting a significant injection of money from the World Bank and the IMF. That, of course, comes, it's another Pandora's box, because Kenya's debt is more than 55 billion US dollars. Okay. But the debt is almost equivalent to 3/4 of the country's GDP. And that actually is one of the issues also that the students, the young people who are coming out are crying out against. So in addition to infusion of money from the IMF, World Bank, for quick short term, of course, you need IMF. You would get that quicker. In addition to that, obviously, he would ask for debt relief. I don't know the prospects of getting that quickly. That is something that, the West usually very reluctant. And even in recent years, China has also become relatively reluctant to doing that as well. Which, of course, you ask yourself, why are these countries constantly in debt? And the answer is because they produce not to satisfy the demands of their domestic economy. They produce to serve the outside world. They produce cocoa to satisfy the sweet tooth of Europeans and Americans. You can't eat cocoa. You produce tea, you're not going to be eating tea. You produce tobacco, you can't eat tobacco. But you're so locked in that global system that it's like an addict. You can't just drop off the drugs tomorrow, right? Because that's become a very critical source of revenue for you to run your government. So how do you wean yourself off? Well, that's something we have not been doing in African countries. You can only wean yourself off if, on the other hand, you are finding other sources of revenue, right?
True.
And you don't need so much the foreign exchange to import, because now you're also producing the products that you are currently importing from the outside world. Let me give you another example, which just illustrated to me how upside down, in some cases, the brain function is for the ruling elite.